Northern Plains, 1887. While neighboring homesteaders chinked logs and stacked cordwood against the coming cold, one Scandinavian immigrant spent his scarce timber building something that made no sense: a slatted fence 10 feet upwind of his cabin, 8 feet tall, 40 feet long, braced against nothing but air. His neighbors called it wasteful. They said every board should pen stock or block wolves, not stand empty in the wind. He built it anyway, posts sunk deep, rails fastened with deliberate gaps. The whole structure designed to do one thing the settlement dismissed as impossible: make winter easier without burning more wood. Then January 12th, 1888 arrived. The children's blizzard hit with 60-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures that dropped from 44 degrees to 11 below in 7 hours. Standard cabins turned into bellows. Families burned through firewood faster than they could split it, fighting drafts that made stoves feel useless. But that cabin behind the wind wall? It held 23 degrees warmer on half the fuel. What did he understand about wind pressure, infiltration, and heat loss that frontier common sense completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Night pressed hard against the northern plains on January 12th, 1888. Inside a 16 by 18-foot cabin, the cast iron stove ticked as metal expanded against heat. The walls popped softly, cottonwood logs settling against the cold. Outside, the prairie had disappeared into a roaring darkness where wind drove snow horizontal like sand across stone. The blizzard had arrived without mercy, 60 miles per hour sustained, temperatures plunging from afternoon warmth into a cold that would kill anything exposed. But inside this particular cabin, the air held strangely calm. The flame in the stove burned steady. The draft through the door seams felt manageable rather than violent. A man could stand 3 feet from the walls without feeling the brutal suck of heat being stripped away. 10 feet upwind of that cabin stood the reason, a structure neighbors had called wasteful for 4 months. 8 feet tall, 40 feet long, built from posts and horizontal rails with boards fastened deliberately loose. 20% open area between slats. 2 angled braces on the upwind side taking the wind load. It looked like a fence designed to hold nothing, and in a sense that was exactly right. It held wind. Or more precisely, it broke wind into something survivable, creating a pocket of calmer air in its lee, where a cabin could breathe without being vacuumed dry of warmth. 300 yards east, another cabin of nearly identical size fought a different battle. Same log construction, same chinking work, same style of door, and single window, but no wind wall. The difference showed in every detail of survival. The family inside fed their stove every 20 to 30 minutes, splitting frozen wood with numb hands, watching the pile disappear faster than seemed possible. Drafts howled through seams the chinking should have sealed. The wind outside wasn't just cold, it was pressure, forcing its way in through every gap, pushing warm air up and out while dragging frigid air down and across the floor. The stove worked hard. The fuel vanished. The cold stayed. Back in the protected cabin, the rhythm ran different. 1 armload of split wood per hour. The stove maintained heat without the desperate feeding cycle. The thermometer near the bunks read 61 degrees. In the neighboring cabin, fighting the full force of wind-driven infiltration, the same style thermometer read 38 degrees, 23 degrees warmer. Same storm, same construction quality. The only variable was that odd fence standing in the wind. The Scandinavian homesteader who built the wall had learned windbreak practice the hard way, first from watching, then from listening, then from building. He had seen brush piled around winter shelters in Dakota camps, a technique so old it appeared in winter count imagery recording harsh years when wind turned survival into engineering. He had heard the plain logic underneath. Cold you can dress for, but wind steals heat faster than any stove can replace it. So he spent September of 1887 turning that principle into sawn timber and driven posts, building outside insulation rather than burning more fuel inside. His neighbors had watched with increasing disbelief. Timber cost labor and money. Every board had to justify itself, pen livestock, stop predators, build something useful. A fence that faced the wind but held nothing made no economic sense. The local carpenter, a man whose livelihood depended on practical building advice, had been blunt. Chink your logs tighter, stack more cordwood, stop inventing problems. The sawmill owner asked what the structure was supposed to accomplish that a well-built cabin couldn't handle alone. The answer, that it would change the wind pressure field around the cabin and reduce infiltration, sounded like theory, and theory didn't split wood or carry water. But the homesteader had built it anyway, using dimensions that matched both his materials and the cabin's exposure. Posts 10 to 12 feet long, sunk 3 to 4 feet deep into prairie hardpan. 9 posts spaced to create 8 bays, 2 horizontal rails per bay at shoulder and knee height, with a third rail added mid-span for rigidity. Boards or slabs fastened with gaps, not solid like a wall meant to stop everything, but porous enough to slow wind without creating the violent turbulence a solid barrier would generate. The structure cost him 5 weeks of labor and a third of his available milled lumber. It stood 10 feet from the cabin's north face, positioned to intercept the prevailing winter wind direction. By early January, it had endured months of ridicule. It caught snow, neighbors said, which was true but irrelevant. It wasted boards that could have expanded the cabin or built a proper livestock shelter. It represented the kind of excessive caution that marked a man as fearful or foolish. The settlement's shared wisdom ran clear. Winter was cold. Fuel was the answer. And if you couldn't keep warm, you hadn't stacked enough wood or chinked well enough. Adding a second structure to solve a problem that didn't exist made no sense. Then the 12th of January arrived, and the wind came with teeth. The day had started deceptively mild, 44 degrees by mid-afternoon in some areas, warm enough that children walked to school without heavy coats. By 9 that night, station records would show 11 below. By morning, 42 below in the coldest reports. The wind hit first, a wall of moving air that turned snow into a grinding weapon and cold into something that killed fast. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Sound became a constant roar. Every cabin became a test of how well its construction could resist pressure, differential, and infiltration. The cabin behind the wind wall passed that test in ways its owner could measure. The wood supply he had estimated for 4 weeks of hard cold would last closer to 8 weeks at the current burn rate. The interior temperature held steady without constant feeding. The stove drew properly because the wind wasn't fighting the chimney draft. When he opened the door to check conditions, stepping into the lee of the wall, the difference registered immediately. Sound dropped, wind pressure eased, snow fell more vertically than horizontally. The pocket of altered air extended roughly 3 times the wall's height downwind, creating a zone where physics worked differently than on the open prairie. In the unprotected cabin 300 yards away, survival had become arithmetic. How much wood remained? How long until dawn? Whether splitting more fuel in the dark was worth the exposure. The family had done everything the conventional wisdom prescribed: tight chinking, a well-set stove, cordwood stacked and split. But they were fighting infiltration they couldn't see and couldn't stop, spending heat faster than they could generate it, burning fuel to warm air that escaped through seams, the wind pressure forced open. The mockery they had aimed at the wind wall 4 months earlier had gone quiet. Now there was only cold and the desperate work of staying ahead of it. The idea arrived in late summer of 1887, when the homesteader had already survived one brutal plains winter and understood what the second would demand. He had come from Scandinavian country where wind and snow were constants, where buildings either respected exposure or failed. The northern plains reminded him of that landscape, flat, open, merciless when weather turned. His first winter in the cabin had taught him that cold alone was manageable. Wind married to cold became theft, stripping heat through infiltration faster than any stove could replace it. He had burned through cordwood at a rate that threatened his supply, had felt drafts that made chinking work feel pointless, had watched frost form on interior walls 3 feet from the fireplace. The problem wasn't the cabin's construction. The problem was everything outside the cabin pressing in. The solution came from watching. In late spring, traveling to trade goods, He had passed a Dakota winter campsite where brush had been piled strategically around the previous season's shelter locations. The arrangement wasn't random. Windward sides bore heavier concentrations, positioned to intercept prevailing wind. An older man, a winter count keeper whose authority came from recording one significant event per year as communal memory, explained the practice without ceremony. Wind makes cold dangerous. Break the wind. Survive the cold. The technique appeared in winter count imagery for harsh years, pictographic records showing shelters with brush windbreaks stacked against the sand-blowing seasons. The knowledge was old, proven across generations, and utterly practical. The homesteader adapted the principle to his materials and skills. Brush worked for mobile camps and temporary structures. He had access to sawn timber, posts, and the carpentry knowledge to build something permanent. By early September, he had committed to the project, a wind wall, positioned upwind of the cabin, designed to create a calmer air pocket in its lee. The dimensions grew from practical constraints and observed need. Height, 8 feet, tall enough to generate a meaningful wind shadow, but buildable with hand tools and available posts. Length, 40 feet, wider than the cabin by significant margins, so wind couldn't simply curl around the ends and attack from angles. Setback, 10 feet from the cabin's north face, close enough to keep the protected zone directly over the structure. The construction began with post holes, 9 holes, sunk 3 to 4 feet deep into prairie soil that fought the shovel and post hole digger. Posts 10 to 12 feet long, set vertically and tamped firm with rocks and packed earth. The labor was heavy, slow, and visible to every neighbor who passed. Questions started immediately. What was he building? A livestock pen without a roof made no sense. A fence to nowhere looked like wasted effort. When he explained the purpose, to break wind and reduce the cabin's heat loss, the questions turned to skepticism. The local carpenter, a man whose reputation depended on practical building knowledge, arrived to inspect the work in mid-September. He walked the post line, checked the spacing, and shook his head. Timber was expensive. Labor was finite. Every board had to serve a clear purpose: enclose animals, stop predators, expand living space. A structure that stood 10 feet from the cabin, holding nothing, blocking nothing useful, violated the basic economy of frontier building. If the cabin was cold, the answer was tighter chinking and more firewood, not a second structure that solved a problem good construction shouldn't have. He said as much, plainly, and the homesteader had no rebuttal that satisfied frontier logic. The wall would work, or it wouldn't. Words meant nothing against the coming winter. By late September, the frame stood complete. 2 horizontal rails per bay, fastened at shoulder and knee height. A third rail added mid-span for rigidity. Then came the critical detail: the boards. He didn't build a solid wall. He fastened slabs and rough-cut boards with deliberate gaps, leaving roughly 20% of the surface open. The spacing looked wrong to everyone who saw it. If the goal was to stop wind, why leave holes? The homesteader explained what he had reasoned through. A solid wall would create turbulence and violent eddies on the downwind side, destabilizing the very air pocket he needed. A porous wall would slow wind without destroying its flow, creating a calmer zone that extended farther downwind. The explanation sounded like theory. Theory didn't keep families warm. The final structural element was bracing. 2 angled braces per section on the upwind side, connecting posts to rails, positioned to absorb wind load. At 50 or 60 miles per hour, wind became a structural problem. The braces were insurance against the wall collapsing during the worst storms, when the entire structure would face pressures most fences never encountered. He built them stout, using hand-forged nails and careful joinery, knowing that failure during a blizzard would mean more than embarrassment. By early October, the wind wall stood finished. 8 feet tall, 40 feet long, 10 feet from the cabin, braced and gapped and positioned to intercept the north wind. The settlement's reaction ran from confusion to outright mockery. The sawmill owner asked how many cattle it would hold. 0. How many wolves it would stop. None. What purpose it served that justified the timber cost? The homesteader's answer, that it would reduce fuel consumption and improve interior warmth by altering wind pressure around the cabin, failed to convince anyone who hadn't watched brush windbreaks protect Lakota winter camps or who hadn't spent a winter fighting infiltration that made stove heat feel useless. The cattlemen, still cautious after the great die-up winters that had killed hundreds of thousands of head and punished every rancher who underestimated weather, stopped to examine the structure in late October. He had learned that exposure killed, that shelter mattered more than profit margins when storms turned lethal. But even he struggled to see how a fence with gaps, standing away from the building it supposedly protected, could change anything meaningful. He said the homesteader had overbuilt for fear, and that winter would prove whether caution was wisdom or waste. The schoolteacher, riding past on her way to the rural schoolhouse, asked if the wall was finished or abandoned mid-construction. The gaps made it look incomplete, like a project someone had started and lost interest in. The homesteader explained again, the gaps were intentional, designed to manage airflow rather than block it entirely. She nodded politely and continued on. The explanation didn't match what fences were supposed to do, and nothing in her experience suggested that air had engineering properties worth managing. By November, the wall had become settlement conversation, a peculiar structure that represented either innovation or foolishness, depending on who was talking. The homesteader's spouse, responsible for stove management and fuel rationing, watched the wood supply and waited. They had survived one winter fighting drafts and burning fuel at unsustainable rates. If the wall worked, the difference would show in measurable terms: armloads per day, hours between feedings, weeks the cordwood lasted. If it failed, they would endure another season of cold and mockery. The wall stood. Winter came on. December arrived with cold that felt routine for the northern plains. Hard freezes, snow cover, wind that made outdoor work miserable but manageable. The homesteader's cabin settled into winter operations with a rhythm his spouse tracked carefully. Stove feeding every hour, roughly one armload of split wood per cycle. The interior temperature held between 55 and 62 degrees, depending on time of day and wind conditions. Frost formed on the walls near the corners where cold leaked through despite good chinking, but the main living space stayed warm enough for work without gloves. The wood supply, stacked outside under canvas and calculated to last through March, burned at a rate that suggested they would finish winter with reserve rather than desperation. 300 yards east, the neighboring cabin without wind protection burned through fuel faster. The family there fed their stove every 20 to 30 minutes during cold spells, fighting infiltration they couldn't see but could measure in wood consumption and interior temperature. Their cabin, 16 by 18 feet like the protected structure, struggled to maintain 40 to 45 degrees on the coldest nights, despite constant fire management. The difference wasn't construction quality. Both cabins used cottonwood logs, careful chinking with clay and moss, and well-fitted doors. The difference was wind pressure and what it did to structures built on open prairie. The mechanism behind that difference was invisible but measurable. Wind didn't just feel colder through some subjective trick of perception. It changed the physics of heat loss in two distinct ways. First, it stripped warmth from exterior surfaces through forced convection. Moving air pulled heat away from logs and walls faster than still air ever could. Research, conducted decades later on windbreak effectiveness, would quantify what frontier homesteaders learned through experience. A 20-mile-per-hour wind could act like 30 degrees colder in terms of how fast bodies and structures lost heat. Second, wind created pressure differentials that forced infiltration. Air piled up on the windward side of a building, compressed and pushing inward through any available gap. On the leeward side, pressure dropped, pulling warm interior air outward through cracks and seams. The cabin became a leaking system, with the stove fighting not just conduction through walls, but active air exchange driven by external pressure. The wind wall changed that equation by altering the local pressure field. Air hitting the porous barrier slowed and spread, losing velocity and force. Behind the wall, in the lee zone extending roughly 3 times the wall's height downwind, wind speed dropped dramatically. The pressure differential weakened. Infiltration decreased. The stove's heat stayed inside longer, requiring less fuel to maintain temperature. The homesteader hadn't invented this principle. Farmers and ranchers across windswept regions would eventually document it through agricultural extension research. but he had reasoned through it using observation and applied it using carpentry skills. His spouse measured the results in practical terms that mattered more than theory. Wood consumption, 1 cord per month instead of the 2 cords the first winter had demanded. Stove rhythm, hourly feeding instead of the frantic 20-minute cycles that made sleep impossible during hard cold. Interior comfort, warm enough to work at the table without layers, warm enough that bedding stayed dry of frost accumulation. These weren't abstract improvements. They were the difference between a winter that depleted resources and one that could be sustained. By late December, neighbors who had mocked the wall's construction began asking questions that sounded different from September's skepticism. How much wood was he burning per day? How often did he need to split more? What was the interior temperature during the recent 3-day cold snap? The homesteader answered plainly, without satisfaction or defensiveness. Roughly 1 armload per hour, splitting every 3rd day instead of daily. 60 degrees near the bunks when outside temperatures hit 15 below. The numbers didn't argue, they documented. The settlement's cattleman visited in early January, curious rather than dismissive now. He had seen winter kill livestock and people, had learned that exposure was engineering failure, not bad luck. He walked around the wind wall, examined the gaps between boards, tested the bracing against wind load. He asked about the 10-foot setback distance. Why not build it closer or attach it directly to the cabin? The homesteader explained the lee zone concept, how the calmer air pocket needed space to form and stabilize, how too close would create turbulence instead of shelter. The cattleman nodded slowly. The logic matched what he had seen with natural windbreaks, ridges, and tree lines that created protected valleys and pockets where stock survived better than on open range. The school teacher, maintaining her rural schoolhouse through the cold months, stopped by on a January afternoon between sessions. She asked about fuel management because keeping the schoolhouse warm on limited wood supply had become a constant struggle. The homesteader's spouse showed her the woodpile, still substantial despite 2 months of steady burning. In a typical winter, they would already be rationing and worrying. This year, the supply looked secure through March with enough margin for late-season storms. The difference was pure efficiency. Less heat lost to wind meant less fuel required to maintain livability. But the real test hadn't arrived yet. December and early January had brought normal plains winter, cold, windy, difficult but survivable with competent preparation. The homesteader knew from Scandinavian experience and from listening to older settlers that true winter crisis came from extremes. Not just cold, but violent cold. Not just wind, but sustained high-velocity wind. Not just snow, but blizzard conditions that made visibility disappear and turned open prairie into a killing environment. Those conditions revealed which preparations were adequate and which were insufficient. Folklore and theory meant nothing against that kind of test. Only measured performance mattered. The settlement's signal service observer, responsible for recording temperature and pressure data for regional weather tracking, had noted unusual patterns in early January reports. Warm air pushing north, cold air massing in Canada, barometric pressure fluctuations that suggested instability. The telegraph system carried warnings imperfectly, messages delayed, priorities confused, rural stations sometimes receiving critical information hours after conditions had already changed. Frontier weather prediction remained crude, dependent on observation and pattern recognition rather than the coordinated forecasting networks that would develop in later decades. Settlers watched the sky, tracked wind direction, and prepared as best they could for conditions they couldn't reliably predict. On the morning of January 12, 1888, temperatures across parts of the northern plains reached 44 degrees by mid-afternoon. Children walked to school without heavy coats. Men worked outside without gloves. The mild conditions felt like a January thaw, temporary but welcome. By evening, the wind shifted to the north and the temperature began to drop. By 9 that night, station records would show 11 below zero. By morning, the coldest reports would hit 42 below. The blizzard struck with winds measured at 60 miles per hour in direct accounts, with snow driven horizontal, with visibility reduced to arm's length. The children's blizzard had arrived, and it would test every structure, every preparation, every piece of frontier wisdom that claimed to understand winter survival. The blizzard hit the settlement at 4:30 in the afternoon on January 12th, with a violence that turned visibility into memory within minutes. Wind that had been moderate northwest shifted hard to the north and accelerated into sustained velocities that would later be estimated at 60 miles per hour in direct witness accounts. Snow that had been falling gently became horizontal projectiles, driven with enough force to sand exposed wood and penetrate through wool clothing. The temperature, which had reached 44 degrees by mid-afternoon in some areas, began a collapse that would define the storm's lethality. By 9 that evening, station records would document 11 below zero. By dawn, 42 below in the coldest measurements. The drop happened fast enough that people caught outside died within hours. Children froze walking home from school, and livestock perished standing in fields. Inside the protected cabin, the homesteader and his spouse felt the storm's arrival through sound and pressure change rather than immediate cold. The roar outside intensified until conversation required raised voices. The walls popped and creaked as wind load tested every joint and seam, but the interior held its temperature. The stove burned steadily, drawing properly because the wind wasn't fighting the chimney draft with the chaotic pressure that plagued unprotected structures. The thermometer near the bunks, checked at 5 o'clock, as the storm reached full intensity, read 61 degrees. The homesteader stepped to the door, opened it carefully against wind resistance, and moved into the lee space behind the wind wall. The difference registered immediately. Sound dropped from roar to moderate rush. Wind pressure eased enough that snow fell more vertically than horizontally. Cold felt manageable rather than lethal. The pocket of altered air extended from the wall to well past the cabin, creating a zone where basic outdoor tasks remained possible. 300 yards east, the unprotected cabin fought a losing battle against infiltration and heat loss. The family there had prepared well by conventional standards, good chinking, stout door, adequate wood supply, experienced stove management, but the wind pressure overwhelmed those preparations. Drafts howled through seams that had been tight in moderate conditions. Cold air forced its way in along the floor, while warm air was pulled out through gaps near the ceiling and around the window frame. The stove, fed constantly with split wood, couldn't get ahead of the loss rate. Every 20 minutes required another armload of fuel. The interior temperature, measured by the same style thermometer that read 61 in the protected cabin, struggled to hold 38 degrees. 23 degrees colder in identical storm conditions, separated by 300 yards, and the presence or absence of wind protection. The family burned through their indoor wood supply by 8 o'clock and faced the dangerous choice of rationing heat or venturing outside to split more from the covered stack. The man made 3 trips into the blizzard, each one a calculated risk against disorientation and frostbite, returning with armloads that disappeared into the stove within 2 hours. His hands, even gloved, lost sensation after minutes of exposure. His face, wrapped in wool, still felt the burning cold that marked the beginning of tissue damage. The axes iced up. The splitting work that normally took 20 minutes stretched to 40 because frozen wood resisted the blade and numb hands couldn't grip properly. By midnight, exhaustion and cold had merged into a survival state where keeping the fire alive became the only objective that mattered. In the protected cabin, the rhythm remained sustainable. 1 armload per hour, split from the covered woodpile in trips that took 5 minutes rather than the desperate outdoor battles the neighboring family endured. The homesteader's spouse tracked fuel consumption against remaining supply and calculated that, at current burn rate, they could maintain interior warmth for weeks rather than days. The stove didn't need constant feeding because the heat it generated stayed inside, working efficiently rather than leaking into the wind-driven vacuum that plagued exposed structures. The difference wasn't minor comfort, it was the operational gap between sustainable survival and resource depletion that led to crisis. By 2 in the morning on January 13th, the unprotected cabin faced a reality that conventional frontier wisdom hadn't prepared them for. The wood supply that should have lasted another month at normal winter consumption rates was burning at 4 times that pace. The interior temperature, despite constant fire tending, couldn't climb above 40 degrees. The children, bundled in every available blanket, slept fitfully against cold that penetrated bedding. The adults, taking turns feeding the stove and splitting more wood outside, were accumulating exhaustion and exposure that would matter if the storm lasted days rather than hours. Frostbite had already marked fingers and cheeks with the white patches that signaled tissue damage. The man made the decision at 3 in the morning. Pride mattered less than children's safety. He told his wife to dress the family in every warm layer they owned, and he stepped into the blizzard for the 4th time that night. But this trip wasn't to the woodpile. This trip was 300 yards west, toward the cabin everyone had mocked for building a useless fence. The journey took 20 minutes of slow, careful movement, staying oriented by memory and the wind direction against his right shoulder. He arrived at the protected cabin's door half frozen, knocking hard enough to be heard over the storm. The homesteader opened the door to a man covered in ice and snow, face wrapped in wool that had frozen to his beard, hands barely able to grip. No words were necessary. He pulled the neighbor inside into air that felt warm enough to sting cold-damaged skin, into a space where the stove's heat actually reached people standing more than 3 feet away. The neighbor stood in that warmth for 30 seconds before speaking. His family was burning through wood they didn't have, fighting cold they couldn't beat, in a cabin that was failing despite doing everything right. Could they come here? Could the protected cabin shelter more than 2 people through the rest of the storm? The homesteader's answer was immediate. Yes. Bring everyone. Bring what fuel you have left and whatever food makes sense to carry. The protected cabin could hold more people because it wasn't spending all its heat fighting wind infiltration. The wood supply would stretch because the structure's efficiency created margin. The neighbor left, returning 40 minutes later with his wife and 3 children, carrying blankets and a portion of their remaining firewood. They arrived exhausted, cold-damaged, but alive. Inside the protected cabin, the temperature still read 58 degrees despite the door being opened twice for extended periods. The stove still burned steadily. The wind wall, standing 10 feet upwind, continued doing the invisible work of breaking wind pressure and creating the calmer air pocket that made survival sustainable rather than desperate. By dawn on January 13th, 7 people sheltered in a cabin built for 2, kept warm by a heating system that would have failed under full wind exposure but succeeded behind the wind wall's protection. The blizzard continued through the day and into the following night, but the crisis inside the protected cabin never matched what the unprotected structure had faced in the first 6 hours. The difference was measurable, repeatable, and impossible to dismiss as luck or exaggeration. The wind wall had done exactly what its builder claimed it would do, change the physics of heat loss enough that survival became engineering rather than desperation. The blizzard broke on the morning of January 14th, leaving the settlement buried under drifts and temperatures still holding 20 below zero. The homesteader's cabin, sheltering 7 people through 40 hours of continuous storm, had consumed roughly half the wood supply that would have been required without wind protection. The stove had maintained heat without the desperate feeding cycles that marked crisis, and the interior temperature never dropped below 52 degrees, even with extra bodies increasing door traffic and heat demand. When the families emerged into clear air and brutal cold, the contrast between survival methods became visible in ways that required no explanation. The unprotected cabin stood with snow driven into every seam and corner, drifts piled 6 feet high against the windward wall, and the interior frozen to temperatures barely above outside ambient. The wood supply was depleted. What should have lasted through February was gone, burned in a single storm fighting infiltration that made efficiency impossible. The family had escaped cold injury only by abandoning the structure and seeking shelter where wind pressure had been engineered out of the survival equation. Their cabin wasn't poorly built. It simply faced the full force of wind-driven heat loss without mitigation, and that force had overwhelmed conventional preparation. No speeches followed. No claims of vindication or demands for apology. The homesteader simply helped the neighbor family assess damage and calculate what remained of their winter supplies. The conversation stayed practical. How much cordwood could be scavenged from the settlement's shared resources, whether the unprotected cabin could be modified with a windbreak before the next hard blow, what construction timeline made sense given materials and remaining winter ahead. The neighbor, exhausted and chastened by how close his family had come to crisis, asked direct questions about post spacing, board gaps, and setback distance. The homesteader answered with measurements and reasoning, treating the inquiry as legitimate rather than late. By January 20th, 7 days after the children's blizzard, 3 new wind walls were under construction in the settlement. The cattlemen, who had survived the Great Die-Up by learning that exposure killed and shelter mattered, started the first one, 8 feet tall, 36 feet long, positioned 12 feet upwind of his cabin. He modified the design slightly, using heavier posts and wider board spacing based on available materials, but kept the core principle intact: create a porous barrier that slows wind without generating destructive turbulence. His construction took 9 days of work spread across 2 weeks, fitting between other winter tasks and weather windows. By early February, it stood complete and functional. The sawmill owner, whose initial dismissal of the wind wall concept had been loud and confident, began his structure in late January without public comment. His version ran 45 feet long to protect a larger cabin footprint, with 3 horizontal rails instead of 2 and slightly tighter board spacing. He worked methodically, testing wind shadow effectiveness by watching snow drift patterns during moderate blow events before the structure was fully braced. By mid-February, his cabin showed the same fuel efficiency gains the original protected cabin had demonstrated. Wood consumption dropped by roughly 1/3 to 1/2, depending on wind conditions. Interior temperature stabilized at higher averages. Stove feeding rhythm became hourly instead of frantic. The school teacher, responsible for maintaining heat in a drafty schoolhouse on limited wood budget, consulted with the homesteader in early February about adapting the windbreak principle to a public building. Her structure faced different constraints: community lumber supply, volunteer labor, and the need to protect a building with multiple windows and a poorly fitted door. The resulting windbreak ran shorter but used the same physics, positioned to intercept northwest wind that drove the worst infiltration. Student families contributed labor. The sawmill provided discounted materials after seeing results in residential applications. By March, the schoolhouse burned 30% less firewood per week while maintaining temperatures that allowed children to work without gloves. The settlement's evolution continued through February and into March as the practical results became undeniable. Families that built wind protection reported measurable fuel savings, 1 extra month of wood supply, or enough margin to weather a second major storm without rationing. Interior temperatures improved by 15 to 25 degrees in identical storm conditions compared to previous winter performance. The stove work became sustainable rather than desperate, allowing sleep and normal household tasks instead of constant fire tending. These weren't subjective improvements or folk claims. They were countable differences in wood consumption, thermometer readings, and operational rhythm. The method spread beyond the immediate settlement through the informal networks that carried practical knowledge across frontier regions. The cattleman mentioned the wind wall principle to ranchers he traded with, describing fuel savings and temperature gains in concrete terms. Travelers stopping at the protected cabin in late winter storms noticed the structural addition and asked questions. The sawmill owner, whose business depended on understanding what building techniques people would actually pay for, started recommending windbreak construction as standard winter preparation for exposed homesteads. By the following autumn, settlers arriving to claim land in the region heard about wind walls as established practice rather than experimental oddity. The broader historical context validated what the homesteader had reasoned through using observation and traditional knowledge. Agricultural research conducted in later decades would document windbreak effectiveness with the precision of controlled studies and instrumentation. Wind velocity reduction in lee zones, infiltration rate changes in protected structures, fuel consumption comparisons between exposed and sheltered buildings. All the effects the homesteader had measured informally would be quantified formally. The research would show that porous barriers perform better than solid walls for creating stable protected zones, that setback distance mattered for lee zone formation, and that wind speed reduction of 50 to 70% in the immediate lee area was achievable with proper design. The homesteader had built according to those principles without access to formal research, guided by logic and traditional windbreak practice documented in Plains native winter camps. The winter count keeper who had explained brush windbreak technique to the homesteader in the spring of 1887 never saw the settlement's adoption of the principle he had described. His knowledge came from generations of experience managing exposure on open prairie, recorded in pictographic history that preserved practical wisdom across time spans. European settlers were only beginning to understand. The homesteader had listened, adapted the technique to his materials and skills, and proven it worked under the worst conditions the northern plains could deliver. The connection between old knowledge and new application remained clear to anyone willing to see it. Survival engineering wasn't invention, it was learning what worked and building accordingly. By April of 1888, when spring finally broke winter's hold on the northern plains, the settlement had changed in ways that went beyond individual structures. The shared understanding of what winter preparation required now included wind management as essential rather than optional. Fuel efficiency mattered not just for economy, but for survival margin when storms exceeded normal severity. The mockery that had greeted the first wind wall in September had disappeared, replaced by practical discussion of optimal setback distances, board spacing ratios, and post steps for different soil conditions. The lesson was plain and tested. On the plains, you don't beat winter by making a bigger fire. You beat it by keeping the wind off your house, and you do that with posts, rails, and the knowledge that wind has engineering properties worth respecting.